combining with the notorious Hafez al-Assad government and other efforts to sort of constrain the population, led farmers and herders who had lived peaceably in the countryside to find themselves without enough water and moving towards the cities, which then led to civil unrest and strife that has overtaken us, led to the deadliest conflict in the modern era. I observed some similar conditions when I was in Jordan last year, an area that's also very water stressed, a country that houses huge refugee populations that have come from elsewhere in the Middle East. And I was in a rural northern section of Jordan where they don't have adequate running water supply, adequate sewage treatment, and now the country, in order to deal with its water stress, was providing less water into the rural areas so that people who had traditionally lived an agricultural lifestyle were being forced to move towards the more urban areas in order just to have enough water for their families. They talk about people being, being stuck in the house the one day of the week that they actually get water in their house. Then they have to stay in the house all day, so that's the only day of the week they can do their washing and some of their primary cooking. And water is also becoming a weapon of war. We see that this is work one of my colleagues has done to look at how water is being weaponized in Syria and Iraq. We see this now also in parts of Africa, water being withheld by Boko Haram, parts of Al-Qaeda, in order to force vulnerable populations into compliance and being used as threats and contaminated. Some of you know about the Mosul Dam and the threat there to collapse the dam. So there are many ways in which these scarce resources now are being weaponized. All right, well, let's come back to the US and let's talk about our own military and our own forces. So, weather has always been fundamental to everything that we do in planning a military operation. Think back to D-Day and how important that weather forecast was to when we sent the troops in for that important, very important D-Day Normandy landing. So from everything from historically, way back even before the last century, continuing to the modern era, we always want the best forecast we can have. And so in the climate era, the weather is less stationary and it's more unpredictable, so it becomes even more important to our forces. And we train like we fight, okay? So now we experience more black flag days. Black flag days are when the temperature is routinely over about 90 degrees, and the wet bulb temperature, the combination of heat and humidity, would put our soldiers, sailor, airmen, and Marines at risk of being exposed for too long. So the cost of lost training days is mounting because we can less frequently send troops out without risk of heat exposure or heat stroke. And it's also making parts of our planet uninhabitable. We now have places in the Middle East and Asia where the temperature is hitting above what is humanly habitable, almost to the level of being at the temperature of a cooked chicken. All right, but now our bases are also at risk here at home. So this is a Department of Defense study that looked at the impacts on military bases. You can see many of them right here in this region, from fires, floods, wind and drought, and extreme weather, extreme temperatures. And you see many of our very important military bases around the country being affected. And nowhere is that more true than right here in the coast, right here along in this Virginia area where we have the largest complex of military facilities in the country. So what does that look like right here? This is a NOAA map showing storm surge risk levels. You probably can all see where you live and work along this map. Here we are in Hampton, which is all red. So the risk levels here in this area are high, which is why, as one of the David said to me over dinner, oh, I learned that now the Navy is raising the piers down at Norfolk. And yes, the Navy is working, as well as many of our other military bases, to become more resilient to these climate effects, which is why we're getting to turn the bad news into some good news in a couple of slides here. So here you see some climate impacts here in Virginia, a variety of them, not only in the coastal areas, but across the state. And it's not only in our coastal areas that were affected. We had very severe flooding at Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska last year, home of Strategic Air Command. The one facility that did really well was the command headquarters, because it was a new building, was built on higher ground, and able to withstand greater flooding. But as you well know, on our military bases, we have a lot of older buildings, a lot of World War II vintage buildings still, and they were built to different standards and not for the climate era. And then here you see the changes across the U.S. in precipitation, and some areas, like our own here, much of the eastern seaboard experiencing more increased intense precipitation. A couple of military bases got hit very hard last year in the hurricanes. Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida, the panhandle of Florida, got hit by Hurricane Florence. We keep our F-22s and F-35s there. Now Langley Air Force Base is the recipient of some of those F-22s that had to be relocated while they repair that base. And Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, also in Hurricane Michael, took severe damage, with the estimates from their two services, the Air Force and Marine Corps, in the billions of dollars. And that's just two bases. We have a lot more, as you saw on those maps, a lot more at risk. So this is a tragedy, but it's also one where we have to turn that tragedy into opportunity. So we have foresight now. We can better, with the science and engineering that's done here at NASA and other research institutions, with our history of technology innovation, we have the opportunity to create and innovate our way into a new future. So I want to talk for a little bit with you about how we climate-proof our future and what the opportunities are. And I think some of them are here. In many ways, you're in the test bed for building resilience. And it's probably not the first time you've heard that, and I know it's not an easy problem to overcome, but it's one where I think our military can set a good example, and we can lead by example because it supports the military mission. And if you look at the traditions in our military of having gone from being seen as an environmental laggard, when I first started working with the Department of Defense, to today, where it's seen as being an environmental and clean energy leader, we have that opportunity now in the climate era. So here are some of the ways in which the military is moving forward, from solar panel power at forward operating bases, to better predicting climate risk, to wind-powered ocean drones for ocean mapping, to looking at new ways of understanding changing Arctic conditions. These are just a few of the examples of innovations that are occurring across the military sector now. Energy is particularly important. The U.S. military is Department of Defense is the single largest energy user in the United States. It's still only 1% of total U.S. energy use, so by itself, it really can't fully change the national energy mix, but it can lead by example where it fits the military mission. So, for example, we learned the hard way during our deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan that we were losing soldiers who were trucking fuel to the front. In fact, 8 out of 10 of our major convoys, our military convoys, were to move logistics like fuel and water. And that was, so General Mattis said, unleash us from the tether of fuel. Unleash us from the tether of fuel. And he said that about 10 years ago, and that really started a whole set of innovation in the Department of Defense to find ways to better power our forces at the front. So a whole set of renewable technologies, solar, wind, efficiency itself is the best fuel, and then finding water locally rather than bringing a lot of bottled water to the front, new ways of providing decontaminated water sources, so purified water sources for our soldiers at the front. So there are a lot of innovations that have occurred. New fuel mixes for our aircraft. We now run some of our aircraft, Navy and Air Force run some aircraft on fuel mixes, blended fuel with various hybrid mixes. And that's going to continue because that helps us diversify our fuel as well. Okay. So this all adds up to a responsibility to prepare. We have unprecedented risks in climate, but we also have unprecedented foresight. So we have a responsibility to prepare ourselves for the future that we've entered. And this has become a global concept that we're working with other militaries to look at how to mainstream climate security across our governance systems, institutionalize it and elevate attention to it, integrate it, and address it as a main part of what we do to prepare ourselves to the future. And here you can see some of the key reports that address this that have occurred just since 2016 in a few ways. Department of Defense reports, Coast Guard Arctic strategy, very forward-leaning, Army Indo-Pacific report, all accounting for climate security risks and how we look into the future. Here are a couple of our important military leaders who have spoken out on this issue. Former Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, Chairman of the Chiefs Joe Dunford, looking at all sources of conflict. I think this quote from General Dunford was in response to a question asked by a senator from Virginia, whom some of you may know. And then we have also important is a growing bipartisan House Climate Solutions Caucus. They sometimes call this the Noah's Ark Caucus because they have to join in pairs of two, a Republican and a Democrat. This got started a few years ago, and you can see here some of the members, and they're really interested in finding solutions and working together, and they're supported by a Marine-led group of the Citizen Climate Lobby that's very involved with this group. Now, internationally, I mentioned at the beginning that the CNA Military Advisory Board, which is U.S. Generals and Admirals, last year we launched an International Military Council on Climate and Security. My partner is the former Dutch Chief of Defense, General Tom Mittendorp, and we have 27 member countries affiliated with us now, military leaders now from around the world. And next week at the Munich Security Conference that brings together national security leaders from around the world, particularly US, Europe, and Europe, we will be launching the first World Climate Security Report assessing climate risks globally and also documenting what a dozen militaries are doing around the world to address climate risks in their military activities. Okay. I'm going to end with this quote from a piece that General Gordon Sullivan, our first chairman of the CNA Military Advisory Board, and myself wrote a little while ago, that we need really to think forward because we want to avoid the next 9/11 or the next Pearl Harbor. We can do that for climate risk if we mobilize today. If we use the power and ingenuity that we have here in this region, you are a core part of it. You are facing these climate risks, the sunny day flooding you have regularly in Norfolk and other places. You can use those challenges to set forth a future and lead by example right here. And I'm very pleased to be here with you to have this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sherri. So we've got a little bit of time for questions. So if you got a question, if you would raise your hand so I can bring you a mic and everybody in the audience can hear your question.
What is being done on a planning basis for climate refugees and for food insecurity?
Well, thank you for that question. We have an increasing number of climate refugees. In our own country, we might say that the villagers of Newtok, Alaska, that are moving their entire village 9 miles upriver are among our nation's first climate refugees. We also have a small village in Louisiana, Ile St. Charles, that's also being relocated. They're on the frontiers of now, whether they're technically refugees is another term. They're in our own country, since they're moving within our own country, they wouldn't technically be refugees, they'd be what one might call internally displaced. In those cases, federal funds are moving those two communities at great expense per person into new locations. That's probably not sustainable. We have to have more standard policies. If you look at the Pacific, for example, the island of Kiribati, which is part of the U.S. consortium of COFA states in the Pacific, Micronesia, Palau, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands. Kiribati has bought land in Fiji because it knows that some of its islands will have to fully relocate. And President Tong, former President Tong of Kiribati, was in Washington at the Wilson Center not long ago for a workshop we did on the Pacific Island states. And he said, you know, we're going to be moving some of our population to Fiji. Some other Pacific Island states have applied, some citizens have applied to New Zealand, for example, for refugee status. So the international law is probably hasn't really caught up with the state of the world. So what's happening is different circumstances in different locations. Some of the migration from Northern Africa into Europe today exacerbates not only from climate impacts, there are violent extremists there as well, but it's sort of fueled by water and food insecurities. The European nations in particular are very heavily involved with trying to address food and water insecurities across many of the North African states, the Lake Chad Basin, Mali, Niger, because they're closer to the problem. They see the impacts on their societies. You know, even countries like Norway, for example, now, not only seeing an opening Arctic and changes in Russia, its near neighbor, but now getting concerned that a changing climate will bring more migration into its own country. So this is a challenge. Our law and our legal standards need to catch up to what the reality of the challenge is, and also figure out what are going to be the humane ways of managing both climate sort of formal migration and the internal displacements.
Another question. Well, there were a lot of hands a minute ago. What happened?
Oh no, there's